The humid Virginia night carried with it the sweetness of magnolia, but beneath it lingered something far more sinister, an aroma that would soon become the scent of death. On the evening of September 15, 1847, 8 of the wealthiest plantation owners in Henrio County gathered inside the dining hall of Willowbrook Estate. They dined on delicacies prepared with skill so precise, so artful, that each man congratulated himself for being part of such refinement. The laughter was loud, the glasses raised high, and the dessert, Judith Henley's honey cakes, was declared the finest they had ever tasted. Yet before dawn, every one of them would be found lifeless. Their mouths foamed, their bodies twisted in violent spasms, their last cries still echoing in the dark corridors of the grand estate. For over a century, the truth of that night was buried, dismissed as nothing more than food gone bad. But the archives whisper something else, a deliberate act of vengeance, meticulously planned by a woman who hid deadly knowledge inside irresistible sweetness. That woman was Judith Henley, a 32-year-old slave whose gift for desserts was renowned across the county. What no one suspected was that her artistry concealed a far more dangerous mastery, one of Virginia's most poisonous plants, passed down in whispered lessons from those who carried knowledge the white masters could never comprehend. Judith transformed her kitchen into an arsenal, her rolling pin into a weapon, her recipes into traps disguised as pleasures. Before we unravel the secrets of her deadly recipes, I want you to do something. Type the words, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you, because once you hear what Judith prepared, you cannot unknow it. And while you're there, let us know where you're watching from, your state, your city, because the reach of this story extends far beyond Virginia. Subscribe now so that you never miss the forbidden history they tried to erase. What turned a woman praised for sweetness into a force of vengeance? Why did she decide that sugar and honey must be laced with venom? To answer that, we must look deeper into the world of 1840s, Henrio County, where wealth glittered on the surface, but beneath lay chains, blood, and a system that fed on human souls. Judith's journal, discovered in 1994 inside the crumbling remains of a slave cabin, revealed more than recipes. It revealed a plan, written in bitterness and ink, for a feast of retribution. Judith had learned early that silence was her shield. On the plantation, words could be as dangerous as chains. A whisper carried to the wrong ear could mean a lashing, a branding, or the endless torture of the pit. So Judith spoke little, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding, said everything. They carried the weight of generations before her, women broken, men beaten, children sold, and inside her chest a fire burned quietly, patient, waiting for the moment it could finally consume. Her gift, they said, was in the kitchen. The masters called it talent, as if she were blessed to serve them. But Judith knew it was survival. Every day she prepared feasts that filled their bellies while she herself lived on scraps. Sweet pies with golden crusts, sugar-soaked cakes, and rich puddings, the kind of desserts that could make men forget their cruelty for a moment. But Judith never forgot. Not the names, not the screams, not the way blood stained the soil of that land. And so she turned her gift into a weapon. At first, no one suspected. A pie placed on a silver tray, a pudding brought out after supper, a cobbler steaming hot, with its sweet aroma filling the air. Judith served with bowed head and steady hands, hiding the storm inside her. But each dessert she crafted carried more than sugar and spice. It carried judgment, a slow creeping poison that tasted like luxury, swallowed with laughter, only to spread like a shadow through their veins. The first master who fell thought it was indigestion. He clutched his belly, red-faced, gasping, as the other overseers laughed at his weakness. But within an hour, his body twisted with pain, his lips turned dark, and his breath rattled like broken glass. The laughter stopped. Judith stood quietly in the corner, her apron spotless, her eyes lowered, as though she had not seen a thing. They buried him within the week, never questioning the cook. But Judith was just beginning. The power of it, the knowledge that she, a woman they thought powerless, could bring them to their knees without ever raising her voice, lit something in her that could not be put out. Each new dessert became a test of her patience, her precision, her ability to lace sweetness with death. And the men who had once mocked her, beaten her, treated her as less than human, began to fall one by one. By the time the plantation began to whisper of a curse, 8 men had tasted her creations, and none had lived to tell the tale. Judith remained silent, her rage hidden in recipes, her vengeance baked into the very desserts they craved. The plantation was never truly silent, but now the sounds had changed. Where once there had been drunken laughter and cruel commands, there were hushed voices, uneasy glances, and the slow gnawing of fear. Death had crept into the big house, not with fire or blade, but with sweetness. Desserts that should have been innocent, comforting, celebratory. Instead, they carried the weight of funerals. The slaves noticed first. They knew Judith. They had watched her hands steady as stone as she kneaded dough or stirred pots. They had seen the way her eyes lingered on the masters when she served them plates heavy with cakes and pies. They felt the current beneath her calm. And though they never spoke of it aloud, never dared to say her name in connection with death, there was a silent reverence when she walked past. For Judith was no longer just the cook. She was justice, cloaked in an apron. The masters, however, clung to superstition. They whispered that the land was cursed, that some dark spirit had risen against them. They muttered about witchcraft, for how else could strong men who whipped others until their backs tore open, fall in such sudden agony from a single meal? They searched for answers, but never in the right places. They blamed the water. They blamed bad luck. They blamed the devil himself. But not one of them thought to blame Judith, the quiet woman who served their tables, who bowed her head as if she had no power at all. Judith, meanwhile, worked with the precision of an artist. She mixed her poisons carefully, never too much, never too sudden. A pinch hidden in sugar, a drop folded into molasses, a powder that dissolved into syrup so smoothly it could never be seen. It was not just murder, it was craft, it was poetry, and with each death she learned more, refined more, becoming as skilled in vengeance as she was in cooking. Yet the silence of the house weighed heavy. The masters grew suspicious of one another. They locked their doors at night. They eyed every dish placed before them, trembling between hunger and fear. Some stopped eating sweets altogether, claiming they had lost their taste. But still, somehow, Judith found a way. Even when they pushed their plates aside, even when they grew paranoid, her food would reach them. Through bread, through wine, through sources they thought harmless. Because Judith knew one thing: a man's greed would always betray him, and no master could resist forever. By the time the 8th body was carried out, the plantation had turned into something like a haunted ground. Shadows seemed longer, whispers sharper. The slaves worked with their heads down, but inside they carried a secret pride, for though they were still bound in chains, they knew freedom had found a weapon among them, and it was baked into sugar. For Judith, the killings were never rushed. She did not strike blindly or waste her fury. Each dessert was a sermon, each poisoned spoonful a verse in the scripture of her revenge. And with every master who fell to the ground clutching his stomach, Judith felt something she had never known before: power. It was not loud. It did not roar like fire or thunder. It was quiet, steady, like the thrum of blood in her veins. For years she had been told she was nothing, property, a shadow, a thing to be commanded. Yet now, with a flick of her wrist and a sprinkle of sweetness, she could decide who lived and who died. Her silence had transformed into dominion. But with power came a dangerous intoxication. At night, when the quarters lay still, Judith would sit by the dim glow of the embers and think about the men she had buried with sugar. She did not feel guilt. No, guilt belonged to those who had chained her, beaten her, and stripped life from her people. What she felt instead was control. For the first time, she was no longer just reacting to the cruelty of others. She was orchestrating it. She was conducting death like music. The others watched her with awe, though no one dared to speak openly. A glance was enough. They knew she was doing what none of them could. She was striking blows where the whip could not reach. And though they feared what might happen if she were ever discovered, they also drew strength from her. Judith had become something more than flesh and blood. She was a story already being born. The masters, however, began to unravel. Each meal was torture to them now. The clink of silver on porcelain, the smell of roasted meat, the sweetness of pie. These things no longer brought pleasure, but dread. Some men demanded that Judith taste their food before they ate, but she did so calmly, swallowing a spoonful with steady eyes, knowing full well she had prepared a different portion for herself. Others tried hiring outsiders to cook, but those cooks never lasted long, driven out by fear, or falling mysteriously ill themselves. It was as though the very land itself had turned against the plantation, and Judith, silent as always, let them believe it. She let them blame curses, the devil, or even one another. The deeper their paranoia sank, the freer she became to move in the shadows. But Judith also understood that power, once tasted, can never be set down. It grows, it demands more, and so her hands, which once only baked for survival, now mixed death with purpose. Not just to punish, but to remind them, every bite, every swallow, that even the sweetest things can rot from the inside. By the fifth death, the plantation was no longer the same world it had once been. The fields still swayed with cotton. The overseers still barked their orders, the sun still scorched the earth. But beneath it all, there was a sickness that no whip could cure. Fear had seeped into the bones of the masters. They no longer trusted their own tables. Each meal became a test of courage. Plates were sniffed, wine cups swirled, forks hesitated midair. Their wives whispered in trembling voices about demons and hexes. Some clutched crosses at their throats, others burned sage, as if smoke could ward off death itself. And still, Judith walked among them, head bowed, hands folded, silent as the grave she was digging for them, one dessert at a time. Word began to spread beyond the plantation gates. Neighboring estates whispered of the plague in hushed tones. Rumors traveled on the wind that men who had once boasted of their strength were falling, struck down not in battle but at their own tables. Some said it was bad harvest air, others claimed poisoned wells. But among the enslaved, a different story circulated quietly from lip to lip, that one woman, with nothing but her cooking, was avenging centuries of pain. The masters tried to choke down their fear, but suspicion gnawed at them like rats. They began to look at their own slaves with sharper eyes. Every movement, every glance, every pause in the kitchen was studied. Overseers barked harder, whips cracked more often, as if cruelty itself could smother the terror rising inside their hearts. But no lash could protect them from the spoonful of sweetness that might carry their doom. Judith moved carefully, never reckless. She chose her moments, her victims, with a patience that was almost holy. Each man she targeted had blood on his hands, crimes carved into the backs and souls of those he thought beneath him. To the outside eye, it looked like chance. To Judith, it was scripture, justice written in molasses and spice. The slaves who knew dared not speak, but in their silence there was power. When they looked at Judith, there was no fear, only recognition. She was not just a cook anymore. She was the ghost in the walls, the invisible hand guiding fate. She was proof that even in chains, resistance could bloom in the most unlikely of places. By the time the eighth master drew his last breath, the plantation itself seemed to buckle under the weight of dread. The air was thick with suspicion, every shadow seemed alive, and the big house, once filled with arrogance and laughter, had become a place of whispers and locked doors. And through it all, Judith kept baking. Sweetness on the outside, death in the center. For she knew what the masters had not yet realized. No wall, no whip, no chain could protect a man from the hunger of his own mouth. By the time the eighth body was lowered into the earth, suspicion no longer hovered in the air like fog. It had sunk into the marrow of every master still standing. Their world, built on domination and certainty, was collapsing from within. Death had not come from the blade of a rebellious slave or the torch of an uprising. No, death had walked right through their dining room, dressed in sugar, butter, and spice. The men who remained could not look each other in the eye without wondering, who is it? Who is serving death at our table? At first, they turned their suspicion outward, toward rival planters. Perhaps, they thought, some jealous landowner had found a way to strike at them. But as the weeks stretched on, their paranoia grew more intimate, more poisonous. They began to suspect one another, brothers-eyed brothers. Friends turned cold. Each believed the other might be plotting with the devil, slipping poison into the wine. And Judith, silent, watchful Judith, fed their madness with nothing but her calm. She never flinched when they demanded she taste a spoonful before serving. She never protested when they searched her kitchen, overturning pots, sniffing jars, scattering flour like snow across the floorboards. She simply bowed her head and obeyed, her hands steady, her eyes unreadable. They found nothing. They always found nothing, because Judith knew what they did not. Suspicion is its own poison. It eats the mind, rots the trust, makes men destroy themselves before an enemy ever touches them. Soon, their meals became battlegrounds of fear. Some refused dessert altogether, but others, too greedy or too proud, could not resist. Those who abstained watched the others eat with wide, desperate eyes, waiting for the first wince of pain, the first gasp, the first collapse. When it came, as it always did, the room would erupt in chaos. Plates shattered, chairs overturned, and Judith stood in the corner, hands folded, the very image of obedience, while inside her heart she counted another victory. But paranoia is a hungry beast. It never stops feeding, and slowly, inexorably, suspicion began to drift toward the slaves. Whispers hardened into orders. Overseers prowled the quarters at night, dragging men into the yard for questioning. Whips cracked, bones broke, yet no confession ever came, because the truth was beyond their imagination. The idea that a woman, silent and unseen, could wield such power was something their minds could not bear. And so they tore at each other, destroying their own kin, while Judith continued her work with quiet hands. It could not last forever. No deception, no mask, no silence can remain untouched when fear becomes too heavy to carry. And so, one evening, as the candlelight flickered across the long oak table, the master's suspicions shifted like a knife turning toward its true mark. Judith. It began with a glance, sharp, lingering, heavier than usual. Then came the muttered words, the way conversations fell silent when she entered the room. Finally, the first accusation slipped free, spoken half in jest, half in terror. Maybe it's the cook. The room had gone cold. No one laughed. Judith did not flinch. She kept her eyes lowered, kept her breathing steady, kept her hands folded as though in prayer. She knew the danger of that moment. A single tremor, a single break in composure, and the weight of all their paranoia would crash upon her shoulders. Instead, she waited, and silence saved her. The masters argued among themselves, voices rising, pointing fingers in every direction. One insisted it could not be Judith. After all, had she not served them faithfully for years? Another countered that such loyalty was exactly what made her the perfect suspect. A third swore it was witchcraft, that no mortal cook could wield such power. Judith let their words wash over her, her face calm, her body still, while inside her heart thundered like a storm. For the first time, the mask had cracked. Not on her face, but in their perception of her. They were beginning to see what she was. That night they forced her to eat first. Every dish, every slice, every spoonful. She did so without hesitation, chewing slowly, swallowing with grace, her eyes never leaving theirs. And when nothing happened, when Judith rose from the table untouched, her body whole, her breathing steady, the masters faltered. Their suspicion had burned hot, but it had burned too fast. For the moment it cooled, but Judith knew better. Once suspicion awakens, it never sleeps again. It only waits, circling, sharpening, biding its time until the moment comes to strike. And Judith, standing at the edge of the firelight, knew her war was entering a new stage. No longer was she the invisible hand behind their deaths. Now eyes were upon her, watching, waiting. The question was no longer whether she would be discovered. The question was whether she would survive long enough to finish what she had started. The air on the plantation grew heavier with each passing day, as if even the trees knew something wicked was coming. The masters, desperate to claw back control, decided that suspicion was no longer enough. It had to be proven, and in their minds, proof meant blood. They called it a witch hunt. Judith was not the only target. Every enslaved woman who had ever stepped into the kitchen was dragged out beneath the sun, questioned, beaten, broken down with threats of fire and iron. Overseers stormed the quarters, tearing through pots, overturning baskets, scattering cornmeal and rice across the dirt as if the poison might be hiding there in plain sight. But nothing was found. No powders, no vials, no devil's tools. Only the trembling hands of the innocent. And still the deaths continued. That was the cruelty of Judith's brilliance. The harder they searched, the more they punished, the more powerless they became. Because death was already inside their walls, served on their finest china, sweetened by the very hands they could not bring themselves to destroy. Still, Judith was watched more closely than ever. 2 men stood by her side as she cooked, their eyes sharp, their tempers sharper. Every pinch of spice, every pour of syrup, every stir of the pot was studied, yet nothing betrayed her. She moved with the same quiet precision she always had, her silence now a shield sharper than any blade. But suspicion is a hungry thing, it always demands more. The masters began whispering about trials, about fire, about burning the guilty alive to rid themselves of the curse. Judith heard these whispers. She felt the heat of their stares, the weight of their hatred pressing closer each day. And though fear clawed at the edges of her heart, she never let it show, for she understood something they did not see. Fear was their master now, not hers. At night, the slaves whispered of her like she was already a legend. Some called her blessed, others cursed, but all agreed she was striking blows they had only dreamed of. And though they dreaded what might come, they drew strength from her silence, her defiance, her deadly craft. The masters, however, grew restless. They wanted a spectacle, a purge, something to reassure themselves that they were still in control. Judith knew the noose was tightening. One more death, one more body at the table, and the storm would break upon her head. The question was not if they would come for her, it was when. The masters had finally decided. Fear alone was not enough to quiet the whispers in their own minds, to smother the unrest spreading like wildfire across the fields. They needed a trial. Not one of law nor of justice. No, this would be a performance. A spectacle meant to prove their power was still unbroken, and Judith would be center stage. They dragged her from the kitchen one dawn, the sky still grey with fog, shackles bit into her wrists, iron heavier than stone. The slaves watched in silence as she was marched toward the great oak in the yard, their faces still, their eyes wide. None dared speak, but the air itself seemed to hum with dread. The masters gathered in a circle, their wives clutching crosses, their overseers holding whips as if steel and leather could keep the devil at bay. They hurled accusations at her: witchcraft, sorcery, poisoning. They claimed she had cursed their tables, summoned demons into their food. They spat the word witch like venom, desperate to name their terror, desperate to contain it with a word. Judith listened, her face calm, her silence heavier than any shout. She did not cry out, did not beg, did not defend herself. She let them speak. For she knew the truth. Their fear was her creation, their paranoia her greatest weapon. They demanded she confess. They promised a merciful death if she spoke the truth. But Judith's lips did not part. She stared at them with steady eyes, unblinking, unyielding, until one by one their voices faltered. For in her silence they saw something that terrified them more than words ever could. They saw that she was not afraid. And men who live by fear cannot understand those who have freed themselves from it. Still, the trial was not truly a trial. The verdict had already been carved in their hearts. Guilty, always guilty. They did not need evidence. They needed blood. They sentenced her to death before the sun would set. The slaves bowed their heads, grief and fury burning behind their eyes. But Judith only straightened her back. For she knew something they did not. Her hands had not yet served their final dish. The banquet was still waiting, and she intended to make it her masterpiece. They believed they had her cornered, shackled, condemned, a witch marked for fire. But Judith knew the truth. The trial had not been her ending. It was the prelude. The masters had written her death sentence, but she was the one who would write the final chapter. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, they gathered in the big house for what they called a last meal. It was meant to mock her, to remind her she was powerless, forced to serve the very men who would burn her at dawn. They ordered her into the kitchen, chains clinking with every step, overseers standing guard at the door. What they did not know was that Judith had been preparing for this moment all along. She had chosen her tools carefully, her ingredients hidden in plain sight, her poisons folded so deeply into sugar and molasses that no search could ever uncover them. Every pie crust, every glaze, every pudding set on the table that night was not food. It was judgment baked into form. The dining room glowed with candlelight as the masters feasted. Their laughter returned, brittle and desperate, clinging to a false sense of control. They raised their glasses, toasted their own triumph, mocked the witch, who stood in silence at the corner of the room. Each bite they took was a victory to them, and Judith watched. She watched the forks lift, the lips part, the mouths chew, the throats swallow. She watched arrogance turn into hunger, hunger into indulgence, indulgence into greed. And then slowly, beautifully, greed began to rot. One by one, their laughter faltered. Forks clattered to the table. A cough broke through the silence, then another, then a chorus of choking gasps. Faces flushed, eyes bulged. Hands clawed at throats and stomachs as agony twisted through their bodies. The great house filled not with laughter, but with the sound of men dying in their own luxury. Judith stood unmoving, her chains glinting in the candlelight, her face carved in stone. She did not smile. She did not weep. She simply bore witness as the men who had enslaved her, who had beaten her people, who had called her less than human, were brought low by the sweetness they craved. When the last body fell silent, Judith finally exhaled. The room stank of death and spilled wine, but to her, it smelled of justice. They had thought they would write her ending. But Judith had written theirs, and though fire might still be waiting for her at dawn, she knew she had already won. Morning came heavy and grey, the sky bruised with storm clouds as if the heavens themselves mourned what had transpired. Word spread fast, the masters of the plantation were dead, struck down in their own dining hall. Their bodies lay where they had fallen, twisted on the floorboards, faces frozen in agony. The slaves moved silently, eyes wide, hearts pounding with a mixture of awe and fear. They knew what Judith had done. They had not seen it, but they felt it. The quiet justice carried in sugar and spice, the vengeance that had slipped past chains and overseers to reach the untouchable. For the first time, the great house stood powerless, emptied of the voices that had ruled their lives. But power, once broken, always tries to reassemble itself. By dawn, riders from neighboring plantations thundered through the gates. They found the scene of carnage, the bodies still warm, the enslaved standing in stunned silence, and at the center of it all, Judith, her chain still fastened, her eyes steady, her body unbowed. They demanded an explanation. The slaves said nothing. Judith said nothing. Silence was her shield. Silence was her weapon. The outsiders called her a witch, a demon, a servant of the devil. They bound her tighter, dragged her to the yard, piled wood high beneath the hanging oak. Fire, they said, was the only cure for such evil. And yet, as they prepared the pyre, there was hesitation in their movements. They could not meet her eyes, for in her calm, in her quiet, they saw something that unsettled them, not fear, but triumph. When the flames were lit, the sky cracked open with thunder. Some swore the storm broke at the very moment the fire caught, as though the heavens themselves were raging. Others claimed the flames refused to consume her, that her figure stood unburning in the smoke until the storm doused the fire. Still others whispered she vanished before the sparks touched her, carried off by something unseen. No one agreed on what truly happened that morning. But what they all agreed upon was this: Judith was no longer a woman. She had become a story, a shadow that lingered in the kitchens of the South, a name spoken in fear and reverence by those who knew the taste of both hunger and power. Children born long after still heard the whispers of the slave woman who baked death into sugar, who brought down masters with nothing but a steady hand and a silent heart. Some said she became a spirit, haunting the plantations forever. Others believed she walked free into the storm, never to be seen again. But one truth remained, carved into memory like scars on the land: Judith had not just killed men. She had killed their certainty. And in that, she had won. Years passed. The plantation where Judith once labored fell to ruin, its fields overgrown, its house abandoned, its name erased from records. But the story of the woman who fed death in sugar could not be buried. It spread in hushed tones, carried by voices too careful to speak loudly, yet too haunted to forget. The tale lived among the enslaved as both prayer and prophecy. They whispered it by firelight, not as tragedy, but as proof that even the smallest hand could topple giants. Judith became a symbol of defiance, the one who broke her chains not by steel but by patience, by waiting, watching, and striking when no one believed she could. Among the masters, however, her name curdled into fear. Overseers warned their households to taste cautiously, to never trust the sweetness of a servant's offering. Some wives refused to let slaves cook at all, fearing the ghost of Judith's hand in every pie. Every spoonful of sugar carried suspicion. Every dessert was a gamble. That was Judith's true revenge. Not the deaths of 8 men, but the poison she left behind in their memory. A poison of doubt, because when power learns it can bleed, it never rests easy again. Even now, centuries later, the legend survives. Historians search for records, but the name Judith flickers in and out, erased and rewritten, as if someone tried to scrub her from existence. Yet folklore persists. Grandmothers still tell it in the South, warning children that sweetness can hide venom, that silence can conceal a storm. Some say on stormy nights, if you walk near the ruins of old plantations, the air smells faintly of cinnamon and nutmeg. The wind carries the scent like a memory, like a warning. And if you listen closely, you may hear the crackle of fire, the rattle of chains, and a woman's steady voice whispering from the dark, "Remember me. Remember what sweetness can do." Judith was not forgotten. She became something greater than a name. She became a legend, a weapon, a ghost in the kitchen of history. And with every retelling, she kills them again. They thought Judith's death, or disappearance, would be the end. Burn her, erase her name, silence her legacy. But legends are not so easily smothered. Like smoke, they slip through cracks, curl around locked doors, and linger where they are least wanted. In the decades that followed, kitchens across the South became haunted places. Housewives whispered of strange accidents, sugar jars shattering in the night, butter curdling without reason, dough rising when it should have stayed flat. Some swore their cakes collapsed no matter how carefully they baked, as if unseen hands had cursed their ovens. And always there was the taste, the aftertaste, that faint, bitter note, subtle but undeniable, as though sweetness itself had been poisoned by memory. Plantation wives grew paranoid. They watched their slaves closely, their eyes darting to every spoonful stirred, every spice sprinkled. They tasted dishes with trembling lips, half expecting to collapse as their husbands once had. For Judith had left them with something worse than poison. She had left them with doubt. And in that doubt, fear multiplied. Among the enslaved, however, her name carried a different weight. Judith became a secret weapon of hope. Mothers told their daughters her story, passing it down like hidden scripture. They said, "Wait, remember, patience is sharper than any blade." Young men whispered it when chains dug too deep, when whips cracked too hard. They remembered that a single woman, with nothing but sugar and silence, had brought masters to their knees. By the time the Civil War split the South, Judith's legend had grown into something mythic. Soldiers told campfire tales of the Sugar Witch, who stalked plantations, killing cruel masters in their sleep. Some claimed she could slip unseen into kitchens, stirring death into pots, her ghostly hand guiding the spoon. Others believed she still lived, unaged, moving from place to place, wearing new faces, waiting for the next table to set. And whenever a master died suddenly, whether from illness, drink, or some unseen hand, it was whispered in the quarters, Judith cooked for him. What was once one woman's act of vengeance had become a movement of memory, and legends once fed, never starved, decades blurred into generations. Plantations crumbled, the war ended, and the South limped into a new, fractured world. But Judith did not die with the chains. Her story survived, crossing fields and rivers, carried in whispers, in recipes, in warnings muttered when no master could hear. For the enslaved and their children, Judith was no longer just a woman. She was a reminder, a lesson carved into the marrow of survival. Sweetness can hide fire, silence can roar louder than thunder. Mothers taught it to their children not with books, but with taste. A pie too sweet, they said, hides something dangerous. A cake too perfect, beware. Judith lived in the balance between sugar and venom, reminding them that nothing consumed blindly is ever safe. But among those who once held power, her name rotted into something darker. Plantation wives, those who survived the fall of slavery, told their daughters to always watch the kitchen, to never eat what came from unknown hands. Even after the chains broke, the fear remained. They saw Judith everywhere, her shadow in the pantry, her eyes in the faces of every servant. Stories twisted with each retelling. Some swore her ghost appeared in mirrors when flour dust settled. Others claimed the spirit haunted the smell of nutmeg, lingering just long enough to turn the stomach sore. One tale, told in the Mississippi Delta, spoke of a family who dared to laugh at her legend. They mocked her memory, saying no slave woman could ever wield such power. That very night, every loaf in their oven turned black, Every sugar jar soared, and by morning the matriarch of the house lay dead at the table, her face frozen in horror, and so the name Judith was whispered once more like a curse. But the strangest thing, the recipes. Somehow they endured. Handwritten notes in the margins of old cookbooks, folded scraps hidden in trunks, instructions passed down from one generation to the next. Cinnamon here, nutmeg there, sugar measured not by spoon but by instinct. Recipes that no one could trace, yet everyone feared. It was as if Judith herself had left behind more than a story. As if she had written herself into the very language of food, waiting for someone reckless enough, or desperate enough, to follow her steps exactly. And when they did, when they baked without caution, the legend said the air would thicken, the sugar would darken, and death would come quietly to the table, just as it had so many years before. Judith had become more than a ghost. She had become a ritual. Judith's name might have faded from official records, but her presence never truly left the world. By the early 20th century, the stories had mutated, taking root in kitchens across the South, whispered in the corners of dusty pantries and tucked into the pages of yellowed cookbooks. The recipes she had left behind, cakes, pies, honeyed pastries, were more than food. They were vessels of memory, of vengeance, of subtle power that transcended death itself. Family recipes, once innocent, now carried warnings in their instructions. A teaspoon too much here, a pinch too little there, and the dish would not simply taste off, it would feel wrong. Some claimed that those who followed Judith's recipes exactly experienced strange dreams, shadows in the corners of their vision, or a coldness in the room that could not be explained. Others believed that any attempt to modernize or simplify her instructions resulted in subtle, almost imperceptible accidents. The sugar would curdle, bread would burn from the center out, or milk would sour before touching the stove. The legend became part of the culture itself. Young cooks dared each other to recreate her desserts, laughing nervously at the idea that a woman who had been dead for over a century could influence the outcome of a simple pie. But when accidents occurred, when knives slipped or fires flared unexpectedly, those laughs turned to whispers of fear. Judith had somehow woven herself into the language of the kitchen, a presence felt in every stir, every whisk, every measured cup of sugar. She had become an invisible mentor, a silent predator, a ghostly teacher of both sweetness and death. Even outside the South, the story traveled. It appeared in hushed conversations at college dorms studying folklore, in marginal notes of culinary history books, in online forums where enthusiasts of dark recipes and true crime speculated about her existence. Some believed the recipes were cursed, or that following them could bring ruin. Others, desperate or fascinated, tried anyway, never fully aware of the centuries of meticulous vengeance baked into each dish. And always, in every retelling, there was a lesson that cut deeper than any knife. Those who underestimate the quiet, the patient, and the overlooked do so at their own peril. Judith's vengeance had begun with chains and slavery, but it had transcended both. Her tools were now timeless sugar, spice, and an unbreakable will. In kitchens everywhere, whether lit by gas lamps or fluorescent bulbs, a faint, unsettling truth remained: sweetness can conceal poison, and some desserts, if handled wrongly, or with arrogance, still kill. By the 21st century, Judith's desserts had become something of an obsession for a select few. Culinary historians, true crime enthusiasts, and dark folklore collectors scoured old archives, libraries, and estate sales, hunting for remnants of her handwritten notes. To the casual observer, these were mere artifacts, yellowed parchment, faded ink, delicate flour smudges. But for those who studied them, the effect was visceral, almost hypnotic. The recipes seemed to pulse with intent. Following them required extreme precision, patience, and respect. Deviation, even slight, reportedly produced strange consequences. There were reports of cooks becoming unwell, kitchen fires igniting without explanation, and a pervasive sense of being watched, even alone. Those who dared to taste a completed dessert described an unnerving aftertaste, a lingering bitterness that seemed to burrow beneath the tongue and into memory itself. Psychologists studying these modern incidents speculated on psychosomatic reactions, on the power of suggestion, and the human mind's capacity to manifest fear. But those who had interacted with the recipes personally knew there was something more. Judith's vengeance had not been limited to time, geography, or circumstance. Her meticulous planning, her patient cultivation of poison and subtlety, had left an imprint that transcended death, a psychological echo that could still unsettle, manipulate, and dominate. Collectors described the experience as addictive. Once a recipe was read, it demanded attention. Once attempted, it required completion. Some spoke of nights spent poring over the instructions until dawn, hands trembling, heart pounding, compelled to follow the steps perfectly, fearing some invisible consequences if they did not. And when the final dessert was served, the effect was often subtle yet undeniable. A tension, a fear, a weight that pressed on the room itself. Among the online community obsessed with cursed or haunted recipes, Judith became a legend beyond folklore. She was the archetype of controlled, patient vengeance, a woman whose meticulous intellect had outlived slavery, time, and death itself. Her desserts were no longer just food. They were psychological weapons, teaching that mastery, patience, and silence could overthrow even the most powerful adversaries. Some swore that when the recipe was properly executed, they could feel her presence, a shadow lingering behind, a quiet satisfaction, as if Judith herself watched from beyond, approving or disapproving of each fold of batter. And for those who failed, who deviated from the delicate, lethal balance, her disapproval could manifest in accidents, misfortune, or worse. Judith had become more than legend, more than story. She was a force hidden, silent, and patient, waiting in every kitchen to test those who dared to follow her path. By the mid-21st century, Judith's legend had become a digital and underground phenomenon. Forums dedicated to dark culinary history, obscure poisons, and true crime shared fragments of her recipes. Some collectors treated them as historical curiosities. Others, more daring, more obsessed, treated them as blueprints, as if invoking Judith herself could grant them a taste of her power. Small groups formed online, sharing their experiences under pseudonyms, recounting how even attempting the simplest of her desserts evoked a strange tension, as if unseen eyes were monitoring their every action. Kitchens became laboratories of fear, flowers measured in trembling hands, honey drizzled with obsessive care, temperatures monitored to the exact degree, every ingredient weighed as if the slightest deviation could summon Judith's wrath. These modern practitioners began to ritualize the act. Some would light candles, not for atmosphere, but as markers of respect and caution. Others chanted her name softly, believing repetition would seal her guidance into the preparation. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments. They would whisper online, invoking the same ceremonial binding Judith's contemporaries might have unknowingly performed centuries ago. But with reverence came temptation and danger. Some experimented, trying to enhance or modernize her recipes, adding flavors or ingredients that were never part of her original design. And in almost every case, accidents followed. Burned hands, scorched kitchens, sudden illness, and occasionally a lingering dread that refused to dissipate. Those who ignored the subtle rules described feeling judged, punished, or mocked by the ghostly presence of the woman who had once fed death as dessert. What fascinated them most was not the mechanics of the toxins, though they studied those obsessively, but the psychological mastery Judith wielded. Her recipes were not only culinary, they were exercises in control, in patience, in strategic timing. The lesson was clear: intelligence, foresight, and restraint were more lethal than any physical weapon. Even those who only studied her writings without acting reported changes. Their perceptions shifted, they noticed patterns, subtleties, and human weaknesses they had previously overlooked. Judith's genius transcended her era. Her vengeance became a dark template for understanding power, manipulation, and the quiet ways that those dismissed as powerless can influence life and death. Judith was no longer just a historical figure. She had become a test, a moral trial, a shadow that judged ambition, obsession, and respect for forces far beyond ordinary comprehension. Those who dared to bake Judith's recipes in full, following every instruction with unwavering precision, often reported sensations that defied explanation. Kitchens would chill without reason, a draft brushing across the back of the neck despite closed windows. Flames would flicker violently, sugar would glint in unnatural light, and the faint scent of herbs long extinct would hang in the air. Some claimed to see shadows that moved independently, shapes in the corners, vanishing when confronted directly. It was as if Judith had extended herself through her creations, embedding not just poison but presence into each dessert. The act of following her recipe became a conduit, her patience, her cunning, her rage at injustice, coursing invisibly through the ingredients, waiting for a vessel. Someone willing to respect, fear, or underestimate it. Accounts of accidents multiplied. A pastry chef in Charleston burned a hand while handling honey from her original formula, describing the sensation as sharp, deliberate, like it was guiding itself. In Richmond, a young baker fainted while whisking, claiming that the rhythm of the batter mirrored the cadence of screams long past. And in a remote Louisiana kitchen, a couple attempting to replicate Judith's signature honey cake reported a thick fog descending upon their workspace, accompanied by the faint sound of chains clinking, laughter distant and cruel. Even those who did not physically bake experienced influence. Historians studying her manuscripts described nightmares of feasts gone wrong, tables overflowing with food that turned to ash in their hands, faces of wealthy men from centuries past frozen in agony. The legend had become interactive. The story of Judith Henley was no longer confined to history books or whispered lore. It acted insidiously on anyone who engaged with it, and yet fascination persisted. Scholars and enthusiasts alike could not resist the pull. Some argued it was a test of respect, a measure of intention. Those seeking knowledge purely for curiosity were warned. Those seeking power, control, or revenge found that the consequences escalated proportionally. Judith's desserts, carefully prepared, rewarded patience and understanding. Improperly handled, they punished hubris and arrogance. It was more than superstition. Her influence had evolved into a system, a quiet, unyielding psychological dominion. She had transformed sweetness into authority, sugar into a vehicle for memory and retribution. And every time a new baker, historian, or collector dared to taste or study her work, the cycle continued, a centuries-old vengeance, patient, invisible, and waiting. In this way, Judith Henley became timeless, a woman whose desserts were never just desserts, whose recipes were never mere instructions, whose revenge never truly ended. In the stories that survived, there was always a final act, a moment when the full weight of Judith's cunning was revealed. For those who pursued her recipes too recklessly, the dessert itself became the final arbiter, delivering consequences that could not be undone. Some lost not just kitchens, but livelihoods, families, or even their lives. Others experienced subtler punishments, relationships fraying, health failing, and a sense of inevitability, as if an unseen hand corrected their arrogance. Those who succeeded, however, reported something darker still. A strange clarity, a sharpness of perception, as if Judith's mind reached across time, imprinting strategy, patience, and the understanding of human weakness directly onto their consciousness. They saw opportunity and threat with terrifying acuity, but along with that gift came a burden, an unshakable awareness that every choice carries consequence, every indulgence has risk, and every act of creation carries a shadow. The most chilling accounts came from modern gatherings attempting to recreate the infamous 1847 dinner at Willowbrook. A small group of culinary historians and enthusiasts, determined to experience history firsthand, prepared a meal following the recipes preserved across centuries. Each dish, honey cakes, layered tarts, and pastries infused with long-forgotten herbs, was crafted with obsessive precision. They tasted, laughed nervously, and shared the food. By the time the night ended, 2 of them fell violently ill, convulsing as others watched in horror. Emergency services arrived too late. The victims were pronounced dead before the toxins, long dormant, had fully revealed themselves. Those who survived spoke of an overwhelming presence in the room, a weight pressing upon their minds, as if Judith herself had judged them, deciding who was worthy, who was reckless, who would carry her legacy forward. It was in that moment that the truth became undeniable. Judith Henley had transcended the limits of her mortal life. Her desserts were vessels, her recipes coded instructions of power and vengeance, her knowledge of herbs and human nature eternal. Anyone who dared to follow her work invited her into their space, whether they acknowledged it or not. She demanded respect, precision, and fear, or she delivered consequences with the patience of centuries. Her legend was not merely a story. It was a system, a living, breathing mechanism for enforcing the lessons she had learned in a life of oppression, rage, and meticulous planning. And with every attempt to recreate her desserts, every modern baker daring to engage with her secrets, Judith's shadow grew stronger, more pervasive, and infinitely patient. The line between past and present blurred. Sweetness became danger, knowledge became power, and a warning some histories are not meant to be consumed lightly. The tale of Judith Henley does not end with the deaths at Willowbrook, nor with the whispered warnings in modern kitchens. It extends beyond time, a thread woven into the fabric of human curiosity, ambition, and the hunger for forbidden knowledge. She is not merely a historical figure, not simply a woman who turned her culinary genius into a weapon. She is an idea, an embodiment of patience, intelligence, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice in a world that denied her humanity. Every honey cake, every layered tart, every subtle infusion of herbs carries her presence. The desserts are not inert, they are vessels of her intent, conduits through which her spirit exercises control, tests respect, and delivers consequences to those who dare engage. Those who approach her recipes with reverence might gain insight, a sharpened mind, and a haunting connection to centuries of suppressed truth. Those who approach them carelessly, arrogantly, or purely for thrill find themselves marked by misfortune, accidents, or death itself. Proof that her meticulous planning, her mastery of the natural world, and her understanding of human weakness were never limited to the 19th century. Her shadow lingers in kitchens, in libraries, in whispered online communities where fragments of her work are shared. She watches through time, patient and unyielding, her lessons embedded not in words alone but in experience. Pain, fear, respect, and the quiet understanding that knowledge carries responsibility. Every modern attempt to recreate her desserts is a ritual, whether consciously recognized or not, a dance with a genius born of suffering and vengeance. And so Judith Henley's legacy persists. The 8 men of Henrio County lie silent, their greed and cruelty avenged through a patient, deliberate act of intellect and mastery. Her children carried forward the weight of her resolve, and centuries later, her influence continues to teach, warn, and unsettle. Sweetness, she proves, is never innocent. Pleasure can conceal poison, beauty can harbor terror, and obedience can disguise rebellion. For those who listen now, who dare to read, watch, or follow in her footsteps, there is a choice: respect the subtlety, fear the consequences, and honor the intelligence behind the desserts, or ignore the warning and risk becoming a part of the story yourself. Judith Henley is not gone. She waits, in flour dust, in honeyed glaze, in the quiet rhythm of a whisk, ready to test patience, obedience, and respect. And in that silence you can feel her presence, reminding you that some histories are never truly buried, some vengeance never forgotten, and some desserts never safe to consume. Type, the veil is broken, twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. The full 20-section script is now complete, blending historical horror, psychological tension, and modern legend into a cinematic, hypnotic narrative.